The morning sun cast long shadows across the livestock auction yard in Cedar Falls, Montana. Dust swirled between weathered boots and cracked fence posts, while men shouted prices over the bleating of sheep and the nervous whinnying of horses. In the center of it all stood three broken things that nobody wanted: a war-scarred soldier leaning heavily on a walking cane, a chestnut mare with a shattered left foreleg, and a 17-year-old girl whose silence spoke louder than any scream. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Marcus Reed adjusted his grip on the carved wooden cane, his right leg throbbing with each shift of weight. The doctors at the VA hospital had said he was lucky to walk at all after the IED explosion outside Kandahar took half his platoon and shredded the muscles in his thigh. Lucky. He'd stopped believing in luck the day he watched his best friend die in his arms while medics worked frantically to stop the bleeding from his own wounds. The girl caught his attention first. She stood beside a heavy-set man in overalls who kept gesturing toward her like she was livestock up for bid. Her auburn hair hung in tangled curtains around a face mapped with old bruises, some yellow-green with age, others fresh enough to still carry the purple-black of recent violence. She wore a dress that had seen better decades, patched in places, with fabric that didn't match, and boots that were more holes than leather. "Sarah's been with us since her mama died of the fever 3 winters back," the man was saying to a potential buyer, a rancher Marcus didn't recognize. "She don't eat much, works from dawn to dusk, and ain't never given me a lick of trouble. Good. With animals, too. Can birth a calf, milk a cow, and she's got gentle hands for the wounded ones." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. The man was talking about the girl like she was property to be sold, not a human being with thoughts and feelings. He'd seen enough in Afghanistan to recognize the look in her eyes, the hollow stare of someone who had learned that survival meant disappearing inside yourself, becoming small and invisible until the danger passed. The rancher circled around her like he was examining a horse for purchase. "She looks half-starved. And those bruises, she clumsy or difficult?" "Neither," the man in overalls replied quickly. "Just needs a firm hand sometimes, you understand. Womenfolk can get ideas if you don't keep them in line. But she's learned her place well enough." Sarah's eyes never moved, never acknowledged the conversation happening around her. She stared at a fixed point somewhere beyond the auction yard, her breathing so shallow, Marcus wondered if she was even fully present. Her hands, he noticed, were clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white. "I'll give you $40 for her," the rancher said, "and that includes taking her off your hands permanent-like." Marcus had heard enough. He pushed through the small crowd that had gathered to watch the negotiation, his cane striking the hard-packed earth with each determined step. "The girl's not for sale." Both men turned to stare at him. The man in overalls, Sarah's guardian, Marcus assumed, looked him up and down, taking in the military bearing that even injury couldn't completely erase, the clean-shaven face and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Begging your pardon, soldier, but this ain't your concern. Sarah here owes me for 3 years of room and board, and I got debts to settle." "What kind of debts?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, the kind that ain't your business. Marcus pulled out his wallet and counted out $60, more than he could afford on his disability pension, but less than he would have spent on a single night's drinking to numb the pain that lived in his bones. "Here's 60. Debts." "Settled." The rancher stepped forward, his face reddening. "Now hold on there, soldier boy. We had a deal. We had a talk," Marcus corrected. "No money changed hands." He handed the bills to Sarah's guardian, who snatched them with greedy fingers. "She comes with me." For the first time since he'd been watching, Sarah moved. Her head turned slowly toward him, and he saw something flicker in her eyes. Not hope, exactly, but a question. as if she was trying to figure out what new kind of hell she'd just been sold into. "Sarah," Marcus said, gently, and watched her flinch at the sound of her name. When was the last time someone had spoken to her instead of about her? "My name is Marcus Reed. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond, but she didn't back away either. Small victories, Marcus thought. He'd learned about those in the hospital. During the long months of physical therapy, when walking 5 feet without falling was cause for celebration. "You got papers for her?" the rancher demanded. "She's not a dog," Marcus replied coldly. "She doesn't need papers." The argument that followed was brief and heated, but Marcus had faced down Taliban insurgents and survived mortar attacks. A disgruntled rancher in Montana didn't even register as a threat. When the dust settled, he found himself responsible for a traumatized girl who looked at him like he might strike her at any moment. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get out of here." They moved through the auction yard slowly, Marcus favoring, his injured leg and Sarah trailing 3 steps behind, like a wary animal. That's when he saw the horse. She was penned in a small corral at the far end of the yard, separated from the other animals. A chestnut mare with intelligent brown eyes and a coat that had once been beautiful but now hung dull and matted. Her left foreleg was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken and poorly healed. She stood with all her weight shifted to her. Other 3 legs, her head hanging low with exhaustion and pain. "That one's been here 2 weeks," said a voice behind them. Marcus turned to see an elderly man in a worn cowboy hat approaching. "Owner brought her in after she got tangled in barbed wire during a storm. Legs ruined. She'll never run again. Barely walks. Been trying to find someone to take her, but..." He shrugged. "Ain't much use for a lame horse." Marcus studied the mare. She lifted her head to look at him, and he saw something in her eyes that he recognized. The weary resignation of someone who had been written off, deemed no longer useful. He thought of the way the other soldiers had looked at him in the hospital, the pity mixed with relief that it wasn't them lying there with a leg full of metal and a future full of question marks. "What happens if nobody takes her?" The old man's expression grew uncomfortable. "Well, she's suffering, son. Sometimes the kindest thing..." "How much?" "Marcus." The name was barely a whisper, but it was the first word Sarah had spoken. He turned, to find her standing closer than before, her eyes fixed on the injured mare. "She's hurt." "Yes," he said simply. "She is." Sarah took a small step toward the corral, then stopped, as if waiting for permission. Marcus nodded, and she moved closer. To the fence, the mare lifted her head again and took a limping step toward the girl. Sarah reached out slowly, carefully, and touched the horse's muzzle. The mare didn't pull away. $15, the old man said, "and that's just to cover the feed she's eaten while she's been here." Marcus counted out the money, watching Sarah. And the horse. There was something happening between them, a recognition that went deeper than words, 2 broken creatures acknowledging each other's pain without judgment or pity. "She'll need care," the old man warned. "Special feed, medicine for the pain, and she'll never be able to carry a rider or pull a wagon. You'd be taking on a burden, not buying a horse." "Sometimes the best things in life are burdens worth carrying," Marcus replied. The paperwork was minimal. Within an hour, Marcus found himself the owner of a lame horse and the guardian of a silent girl. He'd rented a small cabin outside Cedar Falls with his disability money, planning to live quietly and figure out what came after a military career cut short by enemy fire. Now his simple plan had become considerably more complicated. The cabin sat on 5 acres of scrubland, surrounded by pine trees and overlooked by mountains that scraped the sky. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a small barn that had seen better decades. But it was isolated, peaceful, and far from the curious eyes of neighbors who might ask questions. Loading the horse into the borrowed trailer had been a challenge. The mare, who the auction papers identified as Amber, was in significant pain and clearly afraid. It took both Marcus and Sarah working together to coax her up the ramp, Sarah's gentle voice and steady hands making the difference when Marcus's patience began to wear thin. The girl rode in the passenger seat of his truck, pressed against the door as far from him as possible. She clutched a small canvas bag that apparently contained everything she owned. Marcus tried several times to start a conversation, but after receiving nothing but silence in return, he focused on the road and let the quiet settle between them. When they reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Marcus parked near the barn and sat for a moment, looking at his property with new eyes. Yesterday it had been a place to hide and heal. Today it was home to 3 damaged souls who had somehow found each other. "Sarah," he said, and again watched her flinch at her name. "I know you don't know me, and I know you have no reason to. Trust me, but I want you to understand something. You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you, nobody's going to sell you, and nobody's going to make you do anything you don't want to do." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She looked at him with those hollow eyes, and he saw a flicker of something that might have been confusion, as if the concept of safety was so foreign she couldn't quite process it. "There's a bedroom upstairs that's yours," he continued. "Door. Has a lock on the inside if it makes you feel better. You can come and go as you please, eat when you're hungry, sleep when you're tired. All I ask is that you help me figure out how to take care of that horse, because I'll be honest with you, I don't know the first thing about it." For a long moment Sarah sat motionless. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she said, "She needs water and hay, and her leg needs to be looked at." It was the longest sentence she'd spoken since he'd met her, and Marcus felt an unexpected surge of hope. "Can you show me?" She nodded once, then climbed out of the truck and walked toward the trailer where Amber was waiting. Marcus followed, his cane sinking slightly into the soft earth with each step. Getting the mare into the barn required patience and teamwork. Amber was reluctant to put any weight on her injured leg, and the wooden ramp from the trailer to the ground seemed insurmountable. But Sarah had a way with her, speaking in low, soothing tones that seemed to calm the frightened animal. "Easy, girl," Sarah murmured, her hand stroking Amber's neck. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. You're home now." Marcus wondered if she was talking to the horse or to herself. They settled Amber in the largest stall, which Sarah pronounced adequate after a thorough inspection. She found grain in the feed room and showed Marcus how to measure it properly, filled water buckets, and spread fresh hay with an efficiency that spoke of experience. "You've done this before," Marcus observed. Sarah nodded. "My mama had horses before she got sick. Before—" She trailed off, but Marcus didn't push. There would be time for stories later, when trust had been built and wounds had begun to heal. As night fell, they stood outside Amber's stall, watching her eat. The mare was clearly in pain, but there was something almost peaceful about the scene. The soft sounds of chewing, the rustle of hay, the warm smell of horse and leather that filled the barn. "She's beautiful," Sarah said suddenly. Marcus looked at the lame horse with her matted coat and twisted leg. "Yes," he agreed. "She is." That night, after Sarah had disappeared upstairs to her room and he heard the soft click of the lock engaging, Marcus sat on his front porch with a cup of coffee and thought about the strange turn his life had taken. This morning, he'd been a broken soldier with nothing but time and pain to fill his days. Tonight, he was responsible for a traumatized girl and a crippled horse, both of whom needed healing he wasn't sure he could provide. His leg ached in the cold mountain air, and he massaged the worst of the scar tissue through his jeans. The doctors had said the pain would fade with time, but Marcus suspected they were being optimistic. Some wounds went too deep to ever fully heal. From inside the barn came the soft sound of Amber shifting in her stall, probably trying to find a position that didn't put pressure on her ruined leg. Marcus understood that restlessness, the constant search for comfort that never quite came. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. He'd need to find a veterinarian willing to examine Amber, figure out what kind of care she would require, and somehow convince Sarah that she was truly safe in this place. He'd need to learn about horses and healing and how to be responsible for lives other than his own. But tonight, for the first time since the explosion that had torn his life apart, Marcus Reed felt something that almost resembled purpose. 3. Broken things had found each other in a dusty auction yard, and maybe, just maybe, they could figure out how to put the pieces back together. The mountains stood silent guard around the small cabin, and somewhere in the darkness, a night bird called out to its mate. Marcus finished his coffee and went inside, leaving the porch light on for Sarah in case she needed anything during the night. In her room upstairs, Sarah lay on a real bed for the first time in 3 years, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what had happened to her. The soldier, Marcus, had bought her like she was property, but then he'd told her she was safe. He'd said nobody would hurt her, that she could lock her door and come and go as she pleased. She'd heard those words before from other men who'd made promises they had no intention of keeping. But something about Marcus felt different. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, not with hunger or calculation, but with a kind of weary understanding. Or maybe it was the way he'd looked at Amber, seeing beauty in something the world had deemed worthless. Sarah pulled the thin blanket up to her chin and listened to the sounds of the night. No shouting, no heavy footsteps on creaking stairs, no doors slamming in anger, just the whisper of wind through pine trees and the distant sound of Amber moving in her stall. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah closed, her eyes without fear. The first week at the cabin passed like a careful dance around broken glass. Marcus woke each morning to find Sarah already in the barn, moving through chores with mechanical precision. She cleaned stalls, measured grain, refilled water buckets, and tended to Amber's needs without being asked. But she ate her meals standing at the kitchen counter, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble, and when Marcus tried to engage her in conversation, her responses rarely extended beyond yes, no, or I don't know. Amber's condition proved more serious than the auction yard had revealed. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the veterinarian Marcus called from town, arrived on the 3rd day driving, a battered pickup truck filled with medical supplies. She was a small woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that moved with confident efficiency. "This is going to be expensive," she warned after her initial examination. The bone healed badly after the break, probably, because she didn't receive proper treatment when it happened. "She's in constant pain, and there's significant muscle atrophy from favoring the leg." Marcus watched Sarah stroke Amber's neck while Dr. Chen worked, noting how the horse seemed to calm under the girl's touch. "What are her chances for a full recovery?" "None. She'll always be lame, always need special care." Dr. Chen straightened, wiping her hands on a towel. "But for a comfortable life? With the right treatment, she could have years ahead of her. Pain medication, anti-inflammatories, special shoes to help with her gait, physical therapy if you're willing to put in the work." "We'll do whatever it takes," Marcus said, then caught himself using "we" as if Sarah were his partner in this decision. He glanced at her, but she kept her attention focused on Amber. Dr. Chen left them with a complicated schedule of medications, feeding requirements, and exercise routines. She also left behind a bill that would eat through Marcus's savings faster than he'd anticipated. But watching Sarah's face as they discussed Amber's treatment plan, seeing the first spark of something resembling hope in her eyes, he knew he'd made the right choice. The real challenges began after the veterinarian left. Administering medication to a 1,000-pound animal proved more difficult than Marcus had imagined, especially with his limited mobility. Amber was suspicious of the syringes and pills, and more than once, Marcus found himself hopping awkwardly around the stall while the mare danced away from his attempts to help her. Sarah watched these struggles in silence for several days before finally stepping forward during a particularly frustrating session. "She doesn't trust you yet," she said quietly. Marcus paused, syringe in hand, breathing hard from the exertion. "Any suggestions?" Instead of answering, Sarah moved into the stall with slow, deliberate steps. She spoke to Amber in low tones, words Marcus couldn't quite catch, but that seemed to flow like water over stone. The mare's ears pricked forward, and she lowered her head to nuzzle Sarah's shoulder. "She needs to know you're not going to hurt her," Sarah explained, taking the syringe from Marcus's hand. "Animals remember pain better than kindness. She's expecting to be hurt again." Sarah demonstrated the gentle but firm approach required, showing Marcus how to position himself, how to speak in calming tones, how to read Amber's body language for signs of distress. It was the most she'd spoken since arriving at the cabin, and Marcus listened carefully to every word. "You're good." "With her," he observed. Sarah's expression shuttered immediately, and she stepped back from both Marcus and the horse. "I should go start dinner." She fled the barn before Marcus could respond, leaving him alone with Amber and a growing understanding that both female residents of his property carried wounds that ran deeper than anything visible on the surface. The nights were the hardest. Marcus's leg pain intensified in the cold mountain air, and he often found himself pacing the small living room at 3 a.m, unable to find a comfortable position. The prescription painkillers the VA had given him sat unopened in his medicine cabinet. He'd seen too many good soldiers lose themselves to pills that promised relief, but delivered only different kinds of suffering. During one of these restless nights, he heard movement outside. Grabbing his jacket and cane, he made his way to the barn, thinking one of the animals might be in distress. Instead, he found Sarah sitting in the hay beside Amber's stall, speaking in whispered tones to the sleeping horse. "Can't sleep either?" he asked softly. Sarah startled, scrambling to her feet with the quick movements of someone accustomed to being caught where she shouldn't be. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. I was just checking on her, making sure she was okay." "You don't need to apologize for caring about her." Marcus lowered himself carefully onto a hay bale, his leg protesting the movement. "Mind if I sit with you for a while?" She looked uncertain, caught between the desire to flee and something that might have been loneliness. Finally, she perched on the edge of another hay bale, maintaining careful distance between them. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to Amber's steady breathing and the small sounds of the night. An owl called from somewhere in the pine trees, and a distant coyote answered with a lonesome howl. "She has nightmares," Sarah said suddenly. Marcus looked at her in surprise. "Amber? She whickers in her sleep sometimes, and her legs move like she's trying to run. I think she dreams about being caught in the wire." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know something about nightmares." Sarah glanced at him sideways, curiosity flickering in her expression for the first time. "The war?" "Afghanistan. My unit was on patrol when we hit an IED, an improvised explosive device. 3 of my men died instantly. 2 more died on the helicopter ride to the field hospital." Marcus stared at his hands, remembering the weight of leadership, the responsibility for lives that had been lost on his watch. "I dream about it sometimes. The explosion, the smoke, the sounds they made." He trailed off, surprised by how easily the words had come. He'd refused to talk to the counselors at the VA, had shut down every attempt by well-meaning friends to get him to open up about his experiences. But something about the quiet barn and Sarah's undemanding presence made the confession possible. "Do the dreams ever stop?" she asked. "I don't know yet. It's only been 8 months since it happened." Marcus shifted position, trying to ease the ache in his leg. "Do you want to talk about yours?" Sarah was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "My mama died when I was 14. Consumption," the doctor said, "but there wasn't money for proper medicine. After the funeral, her brother came to collect me, said I was family now, that he'd take care of me." She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, like armor. "He had different ideas about what taking care of me meant, and when I tried to fight back, when I tried to run away, he'd remind me that I had nowhere else to go. No money, no family, nobody who cared what happened to me." Marcus felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same anger that had sustained him through firefights and ambushes. But he kept his voice gentle when he spoke. He was wrong about nobody caring. Sarah's laugh was bitter and broken. "You bought me for $60. That's not caring, that's charity." "No," Marcus said firmly. "That's recognition. I saw something in you that reminded me of myself. Someone who'd been broken by circumstances beyond their control. Someone who deserved better than what the world had given them." Sarah studied his face in the dim light filtering through the barn windows. "Why do you care what happens to me?" It was a fair question, one Marcus had been asking himself since that day at the auction. "Because I know what it's like to feel worthless. After I got hurt, after I couldn't be a soldier anymore, I felt like damaged goods, like something that used to be useful but wasn't anymore." He gestured toward Amber's stall. "Then I saw you and her, and I realized we were all in the same boat. 3 broken things that nobody wanted. Maybe we can't fix each other, but maybe we can figure out how to live with being broken." Sarah was quiet for a long time after that, but she didn't leave. They sat together in the barn until the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, 2 damaged souls finding comfort in shared silence and the steady breathing of a wounded horse. The following days brought new challenges. Marcus's disability check was smaller than expected, and the mounting veterinary bills began to strain his finances. He'd spent more on Amber's medication in 1 week than he usually spent on groceries in a month. The special feed Dr. Chen had recommended cost twice as much as regular horse feed, and the orthopedic shoes Amber needed required a specialist farrier who charged premium rates. Sarah seemed to sense his growing anxiety, though he tried to hide it from her. She began rationing her own meals, taking smaller portions, and claiming she wasn't hungry when Marcus offered her seconds. She also started spending more time in the barn, grooming Amber with obsessive thoroughness and cleaning already clean stalls until they gleamed. The breaking point came when Dr. Chen returned for a follow-up visit and presented Marcus with another substantial bill. Sarah was in the barn with Amber, but Marcus could see her listening from inside the stall as he and the veterinarian discussed payment plans and treatment options. "I have to be honest with you, Marcus," Dr. Chen said as she packed her equipment. "This level of care isn't sustainable long-term without significant financial resources. Have you considered other options?" Marcus knew what she meant by other options, and the suggestion hit him like a physical blow. "No, we're not giving up on her." "I'm not suggesting you give up, but there are equine rescue organizations that specialize in caring for horses with special needs. They have the resources and expertise to—" "No," Marcus said again, more forcefully this time. "She stays here." Dr. Chen nodded reluctantly and left, but her words lingered like smoke in the air. Marcus stood in the barn doorway, watching Sarah brush Amber's coat with gentle strokes, and wondered how he was going to keep his promise to care for them both. That evening, Sarah approached him while he sat at the kitchen table, bills spread out before him like accusations. She'd never voluntarily entered his personal space before, and her presence caught him off guard. "I heard what the doctor said," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "About the money." Marcus started to speak, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "I know what it costs to take care of her. I've been adding up the bills, the feed, the medicine. You're spending more on us than you have coming in. Sarah, let me finish." She took a deep breath, gathering courage. "I can work. I'm good with animals, and I learn fast. There are ranches around here that need help, and I could earn enough to pay for Amber's care, to pay you back for what you've spent on me." Marcus felt something break open in his chest. "You think I saved you so you could work to pay me back, didn't you?" Sarah's voice was small, uncertain. "Isn't that how this works? You own me now, so I work for you until I've earned my keep." Marcus pushed back from the table and stood, his movement sharp enough to make Sarah flinch. But instead of anger, his voice carried only sadness. "Sarah, look at me." She raised her eyes reluctantly, and Marcus saw the fear there, the expectation of punishment for speaking out of turn. "You don't owe me anything. Not money, not work, not gratitude. You're not my property, and you're not my servant. You're a human being who deserves safety and kindness without having to earn them." Sarah stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. "Then why?" "Because it was the right thing to do. Because you needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. Because sometimes good people do good things without expecting anything in return." Tears began to slide down Sarah's cheeks, and Marcus realized it was the first time he'd seen her cry. "I don't know how to live like that," she whispered. "I don't know how to just be safe." Marcus sat back down, his own eyes stinging with unexpected emotion. "I don't know how to live with being broken either. But maybe we can figure it out, together." That night marked a subtle shift in the dynamic at the cabin. Sarah began eating full meals again, though she still insisted on helping with the cost by foraging for wild vegetables and herbs that could supplement their grocery bills. She showed Marcus which plants were safe to eat, how to preserve them for winter, and where to find the sweet roots that Amber loved as treats. They established routines that accommodated all their limitations. Marcus handled the heavy lifting and repairs around the property, while Sarah managed the delicate work of animal care. They took turns with the night check on Amber, each learning to read the signs that indicated whether she was having a good day or struggling with pain. Slowly, carefully, they began to build something that almost resembled a family. Not the traditional kind found in storybooks, but something uniquely their own. 3 survivors who had found each other in the wreckage of their individual tragedies and chosen to face the future together. But recovery, Marcus was learning, was not a straight line. There were setbacks and bad days, moments when old fears resurfaced and trust felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. The real test of their fragile new bond was still coming, and when it arrived, it would challenge everything they thought they knew about healing and hope. The arrival of winter in the Montana mountains brought challenges none of them had anticipated. Snow fell in thick, relentless curtains that transformed the landscape into something both beautiful and treacherous. The temperature plummeted until Marcus's breath came out in white puffs, even inside the barn, and the pipes in the cabin froze. Twice in 1 week, despite his efforts to keep them warm, Amber struggled more in the cold. Her injured legs stiffened painfully, making even short walks from her stall to the small paddock an ordeal that left her trembling with exhaustion. "Doctor." Chen had warned them about this, but experiencing it firsthand was different. Marcus watched helplessly as the horse he'd grown to love suffered through each frozen morning, her dark eyes reflecting a weariness that matched his own. It was during one of these brutal December storms that everything changed. Marcus had been in town, picking up supplies and another expensive shipment of Amber's medication from the veterinary clinic. The drive back to the cabin normally took 20 minutes, but the snow was falling so heavily that visibility dropped to mere yards. He crept along the mountain road at a crawl, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel and prayed his truck's worn tires would maintain their grip on the increasingly treacherous asphalt. When he finally reached the cabin, something felt wrong. The porch light wasn't on, and no warm glow emanated from the kitchen windows. Sarah always had coffee brewing and dinner started by the time he returned from these trips, but tonight the cabin sat dark and silent against the storm. Marcus struggled through the knee-deep snow to the front door, his injured legs screaming with each step. The door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. They rarely bothered with locks in their isolated location, but the house felt empty in a way that made his skin crawl. "Sarah?" he called out, dropping his supplies on the kitchen counter. "Sarah, are you here?" Silence answered him, broken only by the howling of wind through the eaves and the rattle of windows fighting against the storm's assault. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the barn, his heart hammering against his ribs with growing panic. The barn door hung open, banging against its frame with each gust of wind. Snow had blown inside, coating the floor in a thin layer of white. Amber stood in her stall, agitated and calling out with sharp whinnies that spoke of distress and confusion. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. Marcus searched every corner of the barn, calling her name until his voice went hoarse. He checked the small tack room, the feed storage area, even the old root cellar behind the building. Nothing. Her winter coat was gone from its hook by the door, and her boots were missing from their usual spot. Panic gave way to a cold, calculating fear that Marcus recognized from his military days. Someone was missing, potentially in danger, and he needed to think strategically rather than emotionally. He forced himself to examine the scene methodically, looking for clues about what had happened and where Sarah might have gone. The snow around the barn was a confusion of footprints, but Marcus's trained eye picked out details that told a story. Sarah's small boot prints led from the barn toward the tree line, but they weren't alone. Larger prints, made by heavy work boots, paralleled hers. The stride pattern suggested someone walking quickly, possibly struggling. Marcus's blood turned to ice. Someone had taken Sarah. He grabbed his cell phone, but the storm had knocked out the cell towers, leaving him with no way to contact the authorities. Even if he could have called for help, the roads were impassable. Any rescue attempt would have to wait until morning, and by then, Marcus refused to let his mind complete that thought. Instead, he loaded his service pistol, the one thing from his military career he'd kept when everything else was taken away, and began preparing for a rescue mission. The trail was difficult to follow in the storm, but Marcus's years of military training served him well. He moved through the forest with grim determination, following the disturbed snow and broken branches that marked the passage of his quarry. His injured leg threatened to buckle with each step, but he pushed through the pain with the same stubborn resolve that had carried him through firefights and ambushes. An hour into his pursuit, he heard voices carried on the wind. Male voices, rough and angry, coming from somewhere ahead through the trees. Marcus moved more carefully now, using the storm as cover, while he closed the distance to wherever Sarah was being held. He found them in a small clearing about 2 miles from the cabin. A ramshackle hunting camp had been set up there, a large canvas tent, a fire ring, and a pickup truck that had seen better decades. 3 men stood around the fire, passing a bottle between them, while a 4th figure sat bound and gagged near the tent opening. Sarah. Even in the dim firelight, Marcus could see the terror in her eyes, the way she shrank back whenever one of the men moved too close. Her winter coat had been stripped away, leaving her in just her thin sweater against the brutal cold. Marcus recognized one of the men immediately, Harold Brennan, Sarah's former guardian from the auction. The man who had sold her for $60 was now apparently trying to reclaim his property. "She's worth more than what that soldier paid," Brennan was saying to his companions. "There's folks down in Denver who pay good money for young girls, especially ones who know their place and don't cause trouble." One of the other men, a heavy-set individual with a scraggly beard, spat into the snow. "She don't look like much to me. Scrawny little thing." "That's what they like," Brennan replied with a laugh that made Marcus's stomach churn. "Young, scared, grateful for any kindness. Break them down proper and they'll do anything you want." Marcus had heard enough. He moved around the perimeter of the camp, using the storm and the men's confidence to get within striking distance. His military training took over, suppressing emotion in favor of cold tactical assessment. 4 targets, 3 armed with hunting rifles, 1 position of cover, limited visibility due to weather conditions. The first man went down without a sound. Marcus approached from behind and used his cane to deliver a precise blow to the base of the skull, dropping the sentry like a stone. The second fell when Marcus tackled him away from the fire, using his superior training to neutralize the threat before the man could cry out. That left Brennan and the bearded man, both of whom were starting to realize something was wrong. They reached for their weapons just as Marcus stepped into the firelight, his pistol trained on Brennan's chest. "Let her go," Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the storm like a blade. Brennan's face twisted with rage and recognition. Well, if it isn't the crippled soldier boy, come to rescue your little whore?" "Last warning," Marcus replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Untie her and walk away." The bearded man made the mistake of trying to bring his rifle to bear. Marcus put 2 rounds center mass, dropping him instantly. Brennan froze, suddenly understanding that he was facing someone who had killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do so again. "You can't just shoot me," Brennan blustered, though his voice shook with fear. "This is kidnapping, murder. They'll hang you for this." "Maybe," Marcus agreed, "but you'll be dead, so that won't be your problem." Brennan's shoulders sagged in defeat. He moved slowly to untie Sarah's bonds, his hands shaking as he worked at the ropes. Sarah didn't move when she was freed, didn't run to Marcus or collapse in relief. She simply sat there, staring at nothing, her mind having retreated to whatever safe place she'd found during her ordeal. "Sarah," Marcus said gently, not taking his eyes off Brennan, "it's time to go home." She blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream, then struggled to her feet. Marcus tossed her coat to her, and she wrapped it around herself with mechanical movements. "This ain't over," Brennan snarled as Marcus backed toward the tree line, keeping Sarah behind him. "She belongs to me, and I'll keep coming for her until I get what's mine." Marcus paused at the edge of the clearing, his eyes locked with Brennan's. "If I see you within 10 miles of my property again, I'll kill you. That's not a threat, it's a promise. Tell your friends, tell anyone else who might be interested in bothering us. The girl is under my protection now, and I don't give second warnings." The journey back to the cabin took twice as long as the pursuit. Sarah moved like a sleepwalker, responding to Marcus's guidance, but offering no initiative of her own. Her mind had shut down, protecting itself from trauma by simply refusing to process what had happened. Marcus recognized the signs from his own experience with PTSD, the 1,000-yard stare, the mechanical responses, the way she flinched whenever he moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. She was back in survival mode, trusting nothing and no one, including the man who had just risked his life to save her. When they finally reached the cabin, Marcus settled Sarah in the living room chair closest to the fireplace and built up the fire until warmth began to chase away the cold that had settled into her bones. He made hot chocolate with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline and the memory of violence, then sat across from her and waited. It took 2 hours before she spoke. "He said you'd get tired of me," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, above the crackling of the fire. "He said men like you only help girls like me because you want something, and when you got bored, you'd throw me away like garbage." Marcus set down his coffee cup with careful precision. "What do you think?" Sarah looked at him for the first time since the rescue, her eyes searching his face for something he hoped she would find. I think if you wanted to hurt me, you wouldn't have come after me in a blizzard. You wouldn't have risked your life." "No," Marcus agreed quietly, "I wouldn't have. But I don't understand why you did. Why do you keep helping me when I can't give you anything in return?" Marcus considered his words carefully. The wrong response could undo all the trust they'd built, could send Sarah back into the shell of fear and self-doubt that had protected her for so long. "Do you remember what you told me about Amber's nightmares?" he asked finally. Sarah nodded slowly. "You said she dreams about being caught in the wire, about the thing that hurt her. But lately, have you noticed that she sleeps more peacefully? That she doesn't whicker and thrash as much?" "Yes," Sarah said, confusion evident in her voice. "That's because she's not alone anymore. She has you watching over her, taking care of her, making sure she's safe. She doesn't have to face her fears by herself." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "That's why I came after you tonight, Sarah. Not because I own you, or because I expect something in return, but because you matter. Because everyone deserves someone who will come looking for them when they're lost." Tears began to slide down Sarah's cheeks, but they were different from the tears she'd cried before. These weren't tears of fear or desperation, but something else. Something that might have been the beginning of healing. "I've never had that before," she admitted. "Someone who would come looking for me." "You have it now," Marcus said simply. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals while the storm raged outside. Sarah fell asleep in the chair, and Marcus covered her with a blanket before making his way to the barn to check on Amber. The horse greeted him with a soft nicker, pressing her muzzle against his hand as if sensing the trauma of the evening. Marcus stroked her neck and spoke to her in the same quiet tones Sarah used, finding comfort in the simple act of caring for another living creature. "She's safe," he told Amber. "We're all safe now." But even as he said the words, Marcus knew their troubles were far from over. Brennan's threats weren't idle, and there would be consequences for the violence that had taken place in the mountain clearing. The authorities would have questions, and not all of them would be sympathetic to a disabled veteran who had taken the law into his own hands. Still, for tonight, they were together. 3 broken souls who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to stand against whatever came next. It would have to be enough. Outside, the wind began to calm, and the first stars appeared through breaking clouds. Morning was still hours away, but Marcus could sense its approach in the subtle shift of the air, the way the world seemed to exhale after holding its breath through the storm. Dawn would bring new challenges, new fears to face and overcome. But it would also bring the promise of another day together, another chance to heal and grow and prove that even the most damaged things could find their way back to wholeness. Marcus locked the barn and made his way back to the cabin, where Sarah slept peacefully by the dying fire. Tomorrow, he would have to figure out how to protect her from Brennan and his associates, how to deal with the legal ramifications of the night's events, how to continue building a life worth living in the shadow of their shared traumas. But tonight, it was enough to know that they had found each other, and that sometimes, when the world tried to tear you apart, the answer wasn't to face it alone. The morning would come, as mornings always did, and when it did, they would face it together. Spring arrived in the Montana mountains like a whispered promise, gradual and tentative at first, then with growing confidence as winter's grip loosened. The snow began its retreat to the highest peaks, revealing patches of brown earth that Sarah examined with the intensity of an archaeologist uncovering ancient treasures. She spent hours walking the property boundaries, cataloguing which plants had survived the brutal winter and where new growth might take hold. Marcus watched her explorations from the porch, noting how different she looked now compared to the hollow-eyed girl he'd brought home from the auction 6 months ago. The constant fear had faded from her expression, replaced by something that resembled curiosity about the world around her. She moved with more confidence, her shoulders no longer perpetually hunched in expectation of a blow. The incident with Brennan had changed something fundamental in their relationship. The sheriff had eventually made it out to investigate the scene in the mountains, finding 3 bodies and evidence of the kidnapping attempt. Marcus's military record and Sarah's obvious condition as a victim had worked in their favor, but there had been questions, paperwork, and uncomfortable interviews that lasted for weeks. Through it all, Sarah had stood by Marcus's account of events, her voice growing stronger with each retelling. She'd looked the sheriff in the eye and described exactly what Brennan had planned for her, what he'd done to her in the years before Marcus found her. Her testimony had been damning and decisive, closing the case without charges being filed against Marcus. But more importantly, the experience had taught Sarah something about her own worth. For the first time in her life, someone had fought for her, bled for her, risked everything to bring her home safely. The knowledge sat in her chest like a warm coal, glowing brighter each day as she began to understand what it meant to be valued. The changes started small. Sarah began asking questions instead of simply accepting whatever Marcus decided. She expressed preferences about meals, suggested improvements to Amber's care routine, and even offered opinions about how to spend their limited resources. These tiny assertions of agency were revolutionary for someone who had spent years being told that her thoughts and feelings didn't matter. Amber, too, was flourishing under their combined care. The mare's injured leg would never fully heal, but the customized exercise routine Sarah had developed was building strength in her other muscles and improving her overall mobility. More importantly, Amber's spirit was returning. She nickered greetings when they entered the barn, actively sought out their attention, and had even begun playing with a large rubber ball Sarah had found at a yard sale in town. The breakthrough came on a warm April morning, when Marcus discovered Sarah in the barn at dawn, not doing her usual chores, but sitting cross-legged in Amber's stall with a worn sketchbook balanced on her knees. The mare stood protectively over her, occasionally lowering her head to nuzzle Sarah's hair while the girl worked with intense concentration. "I didn't know you could draw," Marcus said quietly, not wanting to startle her. Sarah looked up, and, for a moment, he saw panic flicker across her features, the old fear of being caught doing something she wasn't supposed to do. Then she took a deep breath and held up the sketchbook. The drawing was remarkable. Sarah had captured Amber perfectly, from the intelligent gleam in her eyes to the careful way she held her injured leg. But more than just technical skill, the artwork conveyed emotion, the bond between girl and horse, the quiet dignity they shared, the beauty that persisted despite their wounds. "It's incredible," Marcus said, meaning every word. "Where did you learn to draw like that?" "My mama taught me before she got sick. She said art was a way of holding on to the good things so they couldn't be taken away from you." Sarah's voice was soft, but steady. "I haven't drawn anything in years. I thought I'd forgotten how." "Why did you stop?" Sarah's expression darkened slightly. "Harold said it was a waste of time. Said I needed to focus on useful things, not foolish dreams. He burned my old sketchbooks when I first came to live with him." Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger at the mention of Brennan's name, but he kept his voice level. "Well, Harold's Not here anymore. And this is beautiful work, Sarah. You should keep drawing. I don't have proper supplies, just this old book I found in the cabin and a pencil stub. Marcus made a mental note to add art supplies to his next trip to town, regardless of the strain it would put on their already tight budget. Some things were worth sacrificing for, and Sarah's emerging sense of self was definitely one of them. That afternoon, he made an excuse to drive into Cedar Falls, ostensibly to pick up feed for Amber, but actually to visit Morrison's general store. The elderly proprietor, Jake Morrison, had been curious about Marcus's unusual household, but had kept. His questions to himself after the sheriff's investigation made the rounds of local gossip. "Art supplies?" Jake repeated when Marcus explained what he was looking for. "That's an interesting request. Most folks around here are more concerned with practical things." "Sometimes the practical thing is letting people express themselves," Marcus replied, studying the limited selection of sketchbooks, pencils, and watercolor sets available in the small store. Jake nodded thoughtfully. "You know, my late wife used to paint. Beautiful landscapes, portraits of the mountains. I've still got all her supplies up in the back room, meaning to do something with them for years now. If you think your girl could use them—" Marcus looked up sharply. "I couldn't accept a gift like that. Wouldn't be a gift exactly. More like passing them along to someone who'll appreciate them. Emma would have liked that, knowing her paints were still being used to create something beautiful." Jake disappeared into the back room and returned, with a wooden box filled with tubes of paint, brushes of various sizes, canvases, and high-quality paper. It was a treasure trove worth more than Marcus could afford, offered freely by a man who barely knew him. "Why?" Marcus asked. Jake shrugged, but his eyes were kind. "Because that girl's been through enough, and because you're trying to do right by her. Sometimes that's reason enough." Marcus carried the box of supplies home, like it contained precious jewels. Sarah's reaction when he presented it to her was everything he'd hoped for and more. She opened the wooden case with reverent hands, touching each item as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "I can't accept this," she whispered, echoing Marcus's own words to Jake. "It's too much." "It's not from me," Marcus explained, telling her about Jake's wife and the generous offer. "He said Emma would want her supplies to be used by someone who understands what they mean." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they were the good kind. This time, "I've never owned anything this nice, not ever. You own them now. And Sarah, you don't have to earn them or prove you deserve them. They're yours because you're an artist, and artists need tools to create." That evening, Sarah set up an easel on the front porch and began her first painting in years. Marcus watched from inside the cabin, careful not to intrude on the sacred act of creation, but unable to resist glimpsing her work through the window. She painted Amber, of course, but not as the broken horse they'd rescued from the auction. In Sarah's vision, Amber was whole and strong, galloping across an endless meadow with her mane flowing in an invisible wind. It was hope made visible, dreams given form and color. Word of Sarah's artistic talent spread quickly through the small community. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the diner in town, commissioned a painting of her late husband's favorite fishing spot. The local church asked Sarah to create a mural for their children's Sunday school room. Each small project brought in a few dollars and, more importantly, recognition of Sarah's value as something other than a victim or charity case. The transformation wasn't limited to Sarah. Marcus found himself changing too, his own healing accelerated by the simple act of caring for others. His nightmares became less frequent, and the crushing weight of survivor's guilt began to lift as he discovered a new purpose in protecting and nurturing the small family they'd created. He started a garden behind the cabin, working the soil with Sarah's help as she identified which plants would thrive in their mountain climate. His injured leg protested the physical labor, But the pain felt different now, not like punishment, but like the natural consequence of working towards something meaningful. They established new routines that reflected their growing partnership. Marcus handled the heavy construction work needed to improve their property, while Sarah managed the delicate tasks that required patience and intuition. They took turns reading aloud in the evenings, sharing books from the cabin's small library, and discovering each other's tastes and interests. Most importantly, they learned to communicate openly about their struggles. When Marcus had a bad day with his leg pain or PTSD symptoms, Sarah gave him space while making sure he knew she was there if he needed her. When Sarah's anxiety spiked or old memories surfaced, Marcus provided steady reassurance without trying to fix everything immediately. The balance they achieved wasn't perfect, but it was real and sustainable. They were no longer just two damaged people sharing space. They were partners working together toward shared goals. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching Amber graze peacefully in the paddock, Sarah broke a comfortable silence with an unexpected question. "Do you ever think about the future?" Marcus considered her words carefully. 6 months ago, the future had seemed like an impossible concept, something that happened to other people who hadn't been broken by war and loss. Now, watching Sarah paint and seeing Amber grow stronger each day, the future felt like something they might actually have. "I do now," he admitted. "What about you?" "I think about opening a real art studio someday. Maybe teaching other people to paint, especially people who've been hurt and need a way to express what they can't say with words." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if the dream itself was giving her courage. "And I think about Amber, getting well enough to maybe have a foal someday, not to ride or work, just to experience being a mother." Marcus smiled, struck by the simple beauty of her hopes. "Those sound like wonderful dreams." "They're probably foolish," Sarah said quickly, the old self-doubt creeping back into her voice. "No," Marcus said firmly. "They're not foolish at all. Dreams are what keep us moving forward, what give meaning to all the hard work we do today." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "What are your dreams, Marcus?" It was a question he'd avoided asking himself for months, afraid of the answer or the lack thereof. But sitting here with Sarah and watching Amber move with increasing grace despite her permanent injury, Marcus realized he did have dreams again. "I dream about this place becoming a sanctuary," he said slowly, the words forming as he spoke them. "Not just for us, but for other people and animals who need a safe place to heal, people like us who've been written off by the world but still have something valuable to offer." Sarah's eyes lit up with understanding. "A place where being broken doesn't make you worthless." "Exactly. Where healing happens not because someone fixes you, but because you're given the time and space and support to fix yourself." They sat in comfortable silence after that, both contemplating the possibility of a future built on hope rather than mere survival. Amber lifted her head from the grass and looked toward them, as if sensing the shift in their conversation. The mare took a few careful steps closer to the porch, moving with more confidence than Marcus had seen since the day they brought her home. She stretched her neck toward Sarah, who reached out to stroke the soft muzzle with paint-stained fingers. "She's getting stronger," Sarah observed. "So are you," Marcus replied. "So are we all." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have made Emma Morrison proud, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that day at the auction. They'd all been broken then, him by war, Sarah by abuse, Amber by accident and neglect. But somehow, in taking care of each other, they'd found ways to transform their wounds into wisdom, their scars into strength. The future was still uncertain. There would be more challenges, more setbacks, more moments when the darkness threatened to overwhelm them, but they would face those challenges together as a family bound not by blood or law, but by choice and mutual care. Sarah continued painting until the light faded completely, her latest canvas capturing the essence of their mountain home in warm, vibrant colors. When she finally packed away her supplies, she paused to look at Marcus with an expression he'd never seen before, pure gratitude mixed with something that might have been joy. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For seeing me, for believing I was worth saving, for giving me back my art." Sarah's voice was steady, sure. "For teaching me that broken things can still be beautiful." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You taught me that too." That night, as they settled into their respective routines, Marcus realized they'd crossed an invisible threshold. They were no longer just surviving, they were beginning to thrive. The small acts of daily kindness, the gradual building of trust, the shared investment in each other's healing, it had all added up to something larger than the sum of its parts. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to grow, new chances to prove that redemption was possible even for the most damaged souls. But tonight, it was enough to know they'd found their way home, not to a place, but to each other. The trouble started with a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June. Marcus found it slipped under his door when he went out to check on Amber, a crisp white envelope bearing the official seal of Cedar County Child and Family Services. His blood turned cold as he read the formal language that essentially accused him of harboring a minor without proper guardianship documentation and demanded an immediate home inspection. Sarah found him 20 minutes later, sitting at the kitchen table with the letter spread before him like a death sentence. She took one look at his face and sank into the opposite chair, her newfound confidence evaporating in an instant. "What is it?" she asked, though her voice suggested she already knew it was bad news. Marcus handed her the letter without speaking. He watched her face pale as she read, saw her hands begin to tremble as the implications became clear. Someone had reported them to the authorities, and now their carefully constructed life was under threat. "They can take me away, can't they?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Marcus replied grimly. But even as he spoke the words, he knew the reality was more complicated. Sarah was still a minor, and he had no legal standing as her guardian. The $60 he'd paid Brennan at the auction wouldn't hold up in any court of law. The inspection was scheduled for the following Friday, giving them less than a week to prepare. Marcus spent that time researching guardianship laws, consulting with a lawyer in town, and trying to figure out how to legitimize a relationship that had been born from desperation rather than legal process. Attorney Jennifer Walsh was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who specialized in family law. She listened to Marcus's story with professional detachment, taking notes and asking pointed questions about Sarah's background and their living arrangements. "The situation is complex," she admitted when Marcus finished his account. "Technically, you did pay for guardianship, even if the transaction wasn't formally documented. But the state has an interest in protecting minors, and they'll want to ensure Sarah is in a safe, stable environment." "She is safe," Marcus insisted. "Safer than she's ever been." "I believe that, but we'll need to prove it to the court system. The good news is that Sarah is 17, which gives her more voice in the proceedings. If she testifies that she wants to remain in your care, and if we can demonstrate that you're providing adequate supervision and support, we might be able to arrange formal guardianship." Marcus left the lawyer's office with a slim hope and a substantial bill. But at least he had a plan. The key would be surviving the initial inspection and convincing the social worker that their unconventional family was functioning well. Sarah threw herself into preparing for the visit with the same intensity she'd once devoted to survival. She cleaned the cabin until every surface gleamed, organized their finances to demonstrate fiscal responsibility, and even created a portfolio of her artwork to show that she was thriving creatively under Marcus's care. But beneath her busy preparations, Marcus could see the old fears returning. Sarah flinched at unexpected sounds, picked at her meals, and twice he found her sitting in Amber's stall in the middle of the night, seeking comfort from the one being who had never judged or abandoned her. What if they don't understand? She asked him on Thursday evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. What if they look at us and just see a damaged soldier and a girl with no proper family? Marcus chose his words carefully. Then we'll show them what we really are. Two people who found each other when we needed it most and built something good together. We'll show them that family isn't always about blood or paperwork, but about choosing to care for each other. Sarah nodded, but he could see she wasn't entirely convinced. Neither was he, if he was being honest. The system had failed both of them before. Him when the military discharged him without adequate support, her when she was placed with Brennan despite clear signs of abuse. There was no guarantee it would serve them better this time. The social worker arrived precisely on time Friday morning. Margaret Foster was a stern-looking woman in her 40s with greying hair pulled back in a tight bun and a clipboard that she consulted frequently. She introduced herself with professional courtesy but little warmth, and Marcus immediately understood that this inspection would be thorough and potentially hostile. "I'll need to see Sarah's living space first," Miss Foster announced, pulling out a pen and preparing to take notes. "Then we'll discuss the circumstances that led to this arrangement and evaluate whether it's in the miner's best interest to continue." Sarah's bedroom passed inspection easily. It was clean, well-furnished, and clearly decorated according to her own tastes. Miss Foster noted the art supplies, the small library of books, and the general atmosphere of care and attention. "The room is adequate," she admitted grudgingly, "though I notice there's a lock on the inside of the door. That's unusual." "Sarah requested it," Marcus explained. "She'd experienced trauma before coming here, and having control over her personal space helps her feel secure." Miss Foster made another note, and Marcus wondered whether that explanation would work in their favor or against them. The kitchen and common areas also met with approval, but Marcus could sense the social worker building toward more difficult questions. When they finished the physical inspection, she asked to speak with Sarah privately. Marcus retreated to the barn, ostensibly to check on Amber, but really to give Sarah space to speak freely about their arrangement. He spent the time brushing the horse's coat and trying not to imagine all the ways the conversation could go wrong. Sarah found him there an hour later, her face flushed but determined. "She wants to talk to you now," she said. "Marcus, I told her the truth, all of it, about Harold, about what you saved me from, about how you've taken care of me without asking for anything in return." Marcus squeezed her shoulder gently. "You did the right thing." Miss Foster was waiting in the living room with her clipboard and an expression that revealed nothing. She gestured for Marcus to take a seat across from her, then launched into what felt like an interrogation. "Mr. Reed, I've heard Sarah's account of how she came to live with you. I'd like to hear your version of events." Marcus told the story honestly, leaving out nothing important. He described the auction, his impulsive decision to intervene, the challenges they'd faced in building a life together. He spoke about Sarah's artistic talents, her growth and healing, the way she'd helped him find purpose again after his military career ended. "It's an unusual situation," Miss Foster observed when he finished. "A single man taking responsibility for an unrelated teenage girl. It raises certain concerns." Marcus felt his temper flare but kept his voice level. "What kind of concerns? Questions about motivation, appropriateness, long-term stability. The state has protocols for placing children in need, Mr. Reed. There are families specifically approved for fostering, people who've been vetted and trained. And how well did those protocols serve Sarah when she was placed with Brennan? Marcus asked sharply. Where were the home visits and evaluations when he was beating her and preparing to sell her to traffickers? Ms. Foster's expression tightened. That's a separate issue. We're here to evaluate your current arrangement, not relitigate past decisions. Before Marcus could respond, Sarah appeared in the doorway. She'd clearly been listening from the kitchen, and her face was set with a determination Marcus had never seen before. Ms. Foster, Sarah said firmly, may I show you something? The social worker looked surprised but nodded. Sarah led them outside to the barn, where Amber stood peacefully in her stall. The mare lifted her head as they approached, nickering softly in greeting. This is Amber, Sarah explained. Marcus bought her the same day he took me home. She'd been broken, just like I was. Her leg was ruined and everyone said she should be put down because she wasn't useful anymore. Sarah opened the stall door and stepped inside, running her hands along Amber's neck with practiced ease. The horse leaned into her touch, completely trusting and relaxed. But Marcus didn't give up on her, just like he didn't give up on me. He spent money he couldn't afford on veterinary bills and special feed and medicine. He learned how to take care of her even though he'd never owned a horse before. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke. And look at her now. As if on cue, Amber took several steps forward, her gait still uneven but confident. She nuzzled Sarah's shoulder, then turned curious eyes toward Miss Foster. She'll never be the horse she was before the accident, Sarah continued, just like I'll never be the girl I was before Harold. But we're both whole in different ways now. We're both loved and cared for and valued for who we are, not what we can do for someone else. Ms. Foster watched this demonstration in silence, her professional mask slipping slightly to reveal something that might have been genuine emotion. Marcus saved us both, Sarah concluded. Not because he had to, not because anyone made him, but because he has a good heart and he saw that we were worth saving. I've lived in state care, Ms. Foster. I've been in the system you represent. And I can tell you that I've never been safer, happier, or more hopeful about the future than I am right here. The social worker cleared her throat and consulted her clipboard again. Sarah, I appreciate your loyalty to Mr. Reed, but you're still a minor, and the state has a responsibility to ensure you're in an appropriate placement. There are resources available, foster families, group homes, educational opportunities that might better serve your long-term interests. Sarah's response was immediate and unwavering. I don't want those things. I want to stay here with Marcus and Amber. This is my home. Ms. Foster made more notes, then asked to see documentation of Sarah's education, healthcare, and general welfare. Marcus produced the records he'd been carefully maintaining. Regular medical checkups, correspondence with the local high school about completing her GED, bank statements showing Sarah's growing income from her artwork. The girl appears healthy and well cared for, Ms. Foster admitted reluctantly, and her artistic achievements are impressive, but the lack of formal guardianship remains problematic. We're working with an attorney to rectify that, Marcus replied. Jennifer Walsh is helping us navigate the legal requirements. Ms. Foster made another note. I'll need to speak with Ms. Walsh and review the proposed guardianship arrangement. In the meantime, I'm required to file a preliminary report with the department. Marcus felt his heart sink. What does that mean for Sarah? It means we'll be monitoring the situation closely. If my final assessment is positive, and if the guardianship paperwork is properly filed, the department may approve the arrangement. But if there are any concerns about safety or appropriateness, she left the threat unfinished, but the implication was clear. One wrong move, one bureaucratic obstacle, and Sarah could be removed from the only stable home she'd ever known. After Ms. Foster left, Marcus and Sarah sat on the porch in heavy silence. The inspection had gone better than Marcus had dared hope, but they both understood how precarious their situation remained. "What happens if they decide to take me away?" Sarah asked finally. Marcus had been dreading this question, knowing that his answer would either provide false comfort or brutal honesty. He chose honesty. "Then I'll fight for you. I'll hire every lawyer I can afford, appear before every judge who'll listen, and do everything in my power to bring you home. And if that doesn't work—" Marcus looked at her, really looked at her. The hollow-eyed girl from the auction was gone, replaced by someone strong and talented and brave, someone who deserved every chance at happiness the world could offer. "Then, I'll trust that you're strong enough to survive whatever comes next. You've already survived so much, Sarah. You're not the helpless victim they found at that auction. You're an artist, a healer, a young woman who knows her own worth. No matter what happens, no one can take that away from you." Sarah wiped away a tear and managed a shaky smile. "I don't want to be strong enough to survive without you. I want to stay here and help build that sanctuary you talked about. I want to use my art to help other people heal the way Amber and I have healed." "Then that's what we'll fight for," Marcus promised. "Together." That evening, as if sensing the tension in the air, Amber developed a mild colic. Marcus and Sarah worked together to care for the horse, walking her slowly around the paddock until the worst of the discomfort passed. It was routine veterinary care, but something about the shared responsibility felt symbolic, a reminder of what they'd built together and what they stood to lose. "She trusts us completely," Sarah observed as they settled Amber back in her stall. "Even when she's in pain, she knows we'll take care of her." Marcus nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. Trust was the foundation of everything they'd built. Amber's trust in their care, Sarah's trust in his protection, his own trust in their shared future. 3 days later, Ms. Foster called with her preliminary decision. The department would allow Sarah to remain in Marcus's care, pending completion of the formal guardianship process, but with conditions. There would be monthly check-ins, quarterly progress reports, and immediate intervention if any concerns arose. It wasn't the unqualified approval Marcus had hoped for, but it was enough. They had bought themselves time and the chance to prove that their unconventional family deserved to exist. Sarah celebrated by painting a new canvas, a portrait of the 3 of them standing together in front of the cabin, whole and unbroken, despite their scars. It wasn't realistic in the traditional sense, but it captured something true about who they'd become and where they belonged. The bureaucratic threat wasn't entirely behind them, Marcus knew. There would be more inspections, more questions, more opportunities for officials to decide that their healing wasn't happening according to proper protocol. But they'd survived the first major challenge to their new life, and that gave him hope that they could survive whatever came next. That night, as Marcus made his final check on Amber before bed, he found Sarah already there, sitting quietly in the straw beside the horse's stall. She looked up when he approached, her face peaceful in the barn's dim light. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what this time? For fighting for us. For showing Miss Foster who we really are, instead of just what we look like on paper." Sarah's voice was steady, confident. "For teaching me that I'm worth fighting for." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever Sarah expressed gratitude for things that should have been her birthright. Safety, care, respect, love. "You were always worth fighting for, Sarah. It just took the right person." "Seeing it, you saw it," she replied, "even when I couldn't see it myself." As they stood together in the quiet barn, listening to Amber's contented breathing and the gentle sounds of the mountain night, Marcus realized that they'd crossed another invisible threshold. They were no longer just fighting to survive or heal. They were fighting to protect something precious they'd built together. The future was still uncertain, still filled with potential obstacles and challenges. But they'd proven they could face those challenges as a family, united in their commitment to each other and the sanctuary they were slowly creating. Tomorrow would bring new tests of their resolve, new opportunities to demonstrate that healing could happen outside the official channels and approved protocols. But tonight they were together, safe, and determined to remain that way no matter what the system tried to impose upon them. In her stall, Amber shifted peacefully in her sleep, no longer haunted by dreams of wire and pain. Like all of them, she'd learned to trust in tomorrow, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and protected by people who would never give up on her. It was enough. It had to be enough. August brought unexpected visitors to the mountain cabin. Marcus was repairing a section of fence when he heard the rumble of multiple vehicles coming up the dirt road. 3 pickup trucks emerged from the tree line, followed by a horse trailer that kicked up clouds of dust in the summer heat. He set down his tools and walked toward the approaching convoy, his military instincts putting him on high alert. The lead truck bore the logo of Pine Ridge Equine Rescue, and Marcus felt his tension ease slightly as a weathered man in his 60s climbed out of the driver's seat. Behind him came a woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, followed by several younger people who moved with the confident ease of experienced horse handlers. "You Marcus Reed?" the older man asked, extending a calloused hand. "Name's Tom Bradley. This is my wife Helen, and we run the rescue operation. Got a call from Dr. Chen about the work you've been doing with that injured mare." Marcus shook the offered hand, still puzzled by their presence. "Amber's doing well, thanks mostly to Sarah's care, but I'm not sure why." "Because word's gotten around," Helen Bradley interrupted with a warm smile, "about what you've accomplished here, the healing that's happened for both the horse and the girl. We've got a situation we're hoping you might be able to help with." Sarah emerged from the barn, paint-stained apron tied around her waist, and curiosity bright in her eyes. She moved to stand beside Marcus, no longer hiding behind him, but taking her place as an equal partner in whatever was about to unfold. Tom gestured toward the horse trailer. "We've got 5 animals in there that nobody else wants. Horses that have been written off as too damaged, too dangerous, or too expensive to rehabilitate. The county was going to put them down, but we convinced them to give us 30 days to find placements. We've tried every rescue facility in 3 states, Helen added, but these animals need specialized care, individual attention, and most importantly, they need people who understand that healing takes time and patience." Marcus felt a flutter of understanding, but he kept his expression neutral. "What exactly are you asking?" "We're asking if you'd consider taking them," Tom said simply. "Not permanently necessarily, but as a kind of foster situation. Give them a chance to recover in a place where they won't be judged by their productivity or usefulness." Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. "Can we see them?" Tom nodded and moved toward the trailer. One by one he led out 5 horses that bore the unmistakable marks of trauma and neglect. There was a black gelding with rope burns around his neck, clearly the victim of harsh training methods. A paint mare with ribs showing through her dull coat, her eyes hollow with malnutrition. A young Arabian stallion who flinched at every movement, cowering away from human contact. An elderly draft horse with arthritis so severe he could barely walk. And finally, a small Mustang, whose front hooves had been damaged by improper shoeing, leaving her nearly lame. Marcus looked at Sarah and saw his own thoughts reflected in her expression. These animals were them 6 months ago. Broken, discarded, deemed worthless by a world that valued only what served its immediate needs. "The black one is Thunder," Helen explained, pointing to the gelding. "He was used for illegal racing, beaten when he didn't run fast enough. The paint is Moonbeam. She was starved by owners who couldn't afford to feed her but wouldn't give her up. Jasper there, the Arabian, was kept in a stall for 3 years, never allowed to run or play. Old Pete is 28 and was abandoned when his arthritis made him too slow for farm work. and little Sage was founded because someone fed her. Grain constantly, without understanding her dietary needs. Each introduction felt like a punch to Marcus's chest. These weren't just animals. They were individuals with stories, personalities, and the capacity for both suffering and joy. The parallels to human trauma were impossible to ignore. "We don't have the facilities for this many animals," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Our barn only has 2 stalls, and our pasture is small." "We brought building supplies," Tom replied with a grin, "and volunteers willing to work. If you're agreeable, we could have a proper rehabilitation facility set up in a week." Sarah was already moving among the horses, speaking to them in the low, soothing tones that had worked such magic with Amber. Thunder, despite his obvious fear of humans, allowed her to approach and gently touch his scarred neck. The paint mare, Moonbeam, actually took a step towards Sarah, as if recognizing someone who understood hunger and desperation. "They trust her," Helen observed. "That's remarkable. Thunder hasn't let anyone touch him since we picked him up." Marcus watched Sarah work her quiet magic and felt something shift inside his chest. This was what they'd been building toward, he realized. Not just their own healing, but the creation of something larger, a place where broken things could be made whole again. "What would this arrangement look like legally?" he asked, his practical mind asserting itself even as his heart was already committed. "We'd maintain ownership and cover all veterinary expenses," Tom explained. "You'd provide daily care, housing, and rehabilitation. Any horses that recover enough to be adopted would go through our normal placement process. Those that need lifetime care would become permanent residents here, if you're willing." "And the county is okay with this?" Helen nodded. "Dr. Chen vouched for your setup here, said you've accomplished more with Amber than most professional facilities could have managed. The county commissioners were impressed enough to approve a trial period." Marcus looked at Sarah, seeing the hope blazing in her eyes, the way she was already imagining the possibilities. "What do you think?" "I think they need us," Sarah said simply. "And I think we need them too. This is what you talked about, isn't it? The sanctuary where broken things can heal." Before Marcus could answer, Amber appeared at the paddock fence, drawn by the commotion. She whinnied softly, and Thunder's head shot up, his ears pricked forward with interest. The 2 horses regarded each other across the distance, and Marcus saw recognition pass between them, the acknowledgement of shared experience and survival. "All right," Marcus heard himself saying. "Let's do it." The next week transformed their quiet mountain property into a bustling construction site. Tom Bradley and his team of volunteers worked from dawn to dusk, expanding the barn, fencing new paddocks, and installing specialized equipment for caring for injured and traumatized animals. Sarah threw herself into the project with infectious enthusiasm, sketching designs for each horse's individualized rehabilitation space and researching therapeutic techniques. Marcus found himself taking charge of the operation with the same confidence he'd once commanded soldiers. He coordinated schedules, managed resources, and made decisions about layout and functionality. For the first time since leaving the military, he felt like he was using his leadership skills for something meaningful. The horses settled into their new environment with varying degrees of difficulty. Thunder remained skittish and defensive, requiring hours of patient work before he would allow anyone near him. Moonbeam devoured her carefully measured meals with desperate hunger, as if convinced they might be her last. Jasper paced his paddock obsessively, unable to believe he was finally free to move. Old Pete simply stood in one spot, too depressed and arthritic to show interest in his surroundings. And Sage hobbled around on her damaged hooves, clearly in pain despite the special orthopedic shoes Dr. Chen had fitted for her. But Sarah seemed to understand each animal's needs intuitively. She spent hours sitting quietly near Thunder until he began to associate her presence with safety rather than threat. She created a feeding schedule for Moonbeam that helped the mare understand food would always be available. She encouraged Jasper to explore his paddock gradually, celebrating each small sign of curiosity or playfulness. She researched therapy techniques for Pete's arthritis and found ways to make him more comfortable. And she worked with Sage on gentle exercises that gradually improved her mobility. Most remarkably, Sarah began documenting each horse's progress through her artwork. She painted before portraits that captured their fear, pain, and resignation, then created follow-up pieces that showed the subtle changes as healing began. The paintings became a visual record of rehabilitation that was both beautiful and scientifically valuable. Word of their work spread quickly through the veterinary and rescue communities. Dr. Chen brought colleagues to observe their methods. The rescue organizations asked for advice on handling difficult cases. A reporter from the regional newspaper wrote a feature story about the healing ranch that brought donations and offers of help from strangers. But the most significant visitor came on a crisp September morning when Margaret Foster returned for her monthly inspection. The social worker had watched their progress with grudging approval over the summer, but this visit felt different. She brought with her a thick folder of documents and an expression that Marcus couldn't quite read. "Mr. Reed, Sarah," she greeted them formally. "I need to discuss some developments in your case." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Just when everything was going well, when their dream was becoming reality, the bureaucracy was going to intervene again. Ms. Foster spread several documents on the kitchen table. "First, I'm pleased to inform you that the county has approved your formal guardianship application. Sarah, you'll remain in Mr. Reed's legal custody until you reach the age of majority." Sarah's relief was so intense that Marcus had to sit down. Sarah's face lit up with joy, and she reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "However," Ms. Foster continued, and Marcus braced himself for the inevitable catch, "the department has received additional information that affects your situation." She pulled out another set of papers. "It appears that Harold Brennan had outstanding debts at the time of his death, significant debts. The creditors are now claiming that Sarah was collateral for those loans, and they're demanding compensation for their losses." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. "What kind of compensation?" "They want Sarah returned to settle the debt, or they want monetary compensation equivalent to what they claim she's worth on the underground market." Miss Foster's voice was carefully neutral, but Marcus could see the disgust in her eyes. Sarah's face had gone pale, and Marcus saw the old fear creeping back into her expression. "Can they do that? Can they take me away?" Miss Foster hesitated before answering. "Legally, their claim is questionable at best, but they've filed a lawsuit, and until it's resolved, there could be complications." "What kind of complications?" Marcus demanded. "They could seek a court order for Sarah's return. They could claim that your guardianship is invalid because it was based on a fraudulent transaction. They could—" Ms. Foster trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the implications. Marcus stood up abruptly, his military bearing asserting itself. "Over my dead body. Mr. Reed, I understand your feelings, but threatening violence won't help Sarah's situation." "I'm not threatening violence," Marcus replied coldly. "I'm stating a fact. No one is taking Sarah anywhere against her will. I don't care what papers they file or what courts they try to manipulate. Sarah found her voice, and when she spoke, it was with a strength that surprised everyone, including herself. Ms. Foster, I'm 17 years old. In less than a year, I'll be an adult and can make my own decisions. Until then, I choose to stay here with Marcus. I choose this life, this family, this home, and if anyone tries to take me away, I'll fight them every step of the way." Miss Foster looked at Sarah with something that might have been respect. "The court will take your preferences into consideration, Sarah, But these people have resources, connections, and apparently no moral boundaries. This could get very ugly. Marcus sat back down, his mind already working through the tactical implications. What do you recommend? Lawyer up. Document everything. Make your case to the media if necessary. Show the world what you've built here and how Sarah has thrived under your care. Miss Foster paused, then added quietly, and be prepared for a fight. These people don't give up easily. After Miss Foster left, Marcus and Sarah sat in heavy silence, the joy of their official guardianship overshadowed by this new threat. Through the window they could see the horses grazing peacefully in their paddocks, Thunder actually allowing Amber to graze beside him, a sign of progress that had taken weeks to achieve. I won't go, Sarah said finally. I don't care what they threaten or what courts they try to use. This is my home now. Marcus reached across the table and took her hands in his. Then we fight. We use every resource we have, every ally we've made, every bit of progress you've achieved. We show the world who you really are and what you've become. What if it's not enough? Marcus looked out at the horses, at the sanctuary they'd built together, at the evidence of healing and hope that surrounded them. Then we trust that the truth is stronger than lies, that love is more powerful than greed, and that sometimes broken things can become stronger than they ever were before. That afternoon, Sarah painted with fierce intensity, creating a canvas that showed all 6 horses, running free across an endless meadow, their scars and injuries transformed into marks of character and survival. In the center of the painting, barely visible unless you looked closely, was a small cabin surrounded by mountains, representing the safe haven that had made their freedom possible. It was a painting about claiming your place in the world, about refusing to be defined by what others thought you were worth. It was about the power of choosing your own family and fighting for the right to exist on your own terms. As evening approached, Marcus and Sarah stood at the paddock fence watching their growing herd. Thunder had allowed Sarah to brush him for the first time that day. Moonbeam was showing signs of weight gain and renewed spirit. Jasper had actually played with a ball Sarah had placed in his paddock. Old Pete was walking with less stiffness thanks to his new medication regimen, and Sage was moving with increasing confidence on her healing hooves. They're all going to make it, Sarah observed. Every single one of them is going to heal and thrive, just like you did, Marcus replied. Sarah smiled, and in that expression, Marcus saw no trace of the broken girl he'd rescued from the auction. This was a young woman who knew her own worth, who had found her purpose, and who would fight fiercely to protect what she'd built. We're going to win this battle, she said with quiet confidence. Because we're not fighting for money or property or legal technicalities. We're fighting for family, for home, for the right to heal and help others heal. Marcus nodded, feeling the same certainty settling in his bones. They'd been tested before and emerged stronger. This would be their ultimate test, the final confrontation that would determine whether their unconventional family had the right to exist. But as he watched Sarah interact with the horses, saw the love and skill and dedication she brought to their care, Marcus knew they had something their opponents could never understand or defeat. They had each other, and they had a purpose larger than themselves. The battle was coming, but they were ready for it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to everything they'd built. But tonight, they were together, surrounded by the evidence of their success and strengthened by the knowledge that they were fighting for something worth any sacrifice. The healing ranch was no longer just a dream. It was a reality. And no court or creditor or system would be allowed to destroy what love and patience and determination had created. They had claimed their place in the world, and they would defend it with everything they had. The courthouse in Cedar Falls had never seen anything like the crowd that gathered on a cold October morning. News of the legal challenge to Sarah's guardianship had spread through social media and local news outlets, drawing supporters from across the state. Veterans groups, animal rescue organizations, abuse survivors, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by their story filled the courthouse steps and spilled onto the surrounding streets. Marcus adjusted his dress, uniform, the first time he'd worn it since his medical discharge, and straightened his shoulders as they walked through the crowd. Sarah moved beside him with quiet dignity, wearing a simple blue dress she'd bought with money from her latest art commission. In her hands, she carried a leather portfolio containing letters of support from everyone whose life they'd touched. Attorney Jennifer Walsh met them at the courthouse entrance, her expression grim but determined. "I won't lie to you," she said quietly as they climbed the steps. "The opposing counsel has deep pockets and connections. They've painted this as a case about protecting property rights and honoring legal debts. But we have something they don't: the truth." The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Judge Patricia Martinez, a stern woman in her 50s, with silver hair and sharp eyes, called for order as the proceedings began. Across the aisle sat three men in expensive suits representing the consortium of creditors who claimed ownership of Sarah. Their lead attorney, a polished man named Richard Hawthorne, exuded the kind of confidence that came from never having lost a case he cared about winning. "Your Honor," Hawthorne began his opening statement, "this case is fundamentally about the rule of law. Harold Brennan entered into legitimate business arrangements using the minor Sarah Davis as collateral. Those debts remain unpaid, and my clients have every right to collect what is owed to them." Marcus felt Sarah tense beside him, but when he glanced at her, he saw steel in her eyes rather than fear. The broken girl, who had once accepted whatever fate others imposed on her, was gone forever. Jennifer Walsh rose for their defense, her voice carrying clear across the packed courtroom. "Your Honor, this case is about human dignity and the fundamental principle that people cannot be owned, bought, or sold. Sarah Davis is not property to be traded for debt. She is a human being who has overcome tremendous trauma to build a meaningful life, and she has the right to choose her own future." The testimony that followed was harrowing and inspiring in equal measure. Dr. Chen took the stand to describe the parallels between animal and human trauma recovery, explaining how the healing environment Marcus and Sarah had created was unprecedented in her experience. Margaret Foster, despite her initial skepticism, testified about the remarkable progress Sarah had made under Marcus's guardianship. Tom Bradley from Pine Ridge Equine Rescue spoke about the professional-level rehabilitation program they'd established, describing success rates that exceeded those of facilities with million-dollar budgets. A teacher from the local high school testified about Sarah's academic achievements and her plans to pursue veterinary medicine. But the most powerful testimony came from Sarah herself. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "I want to tell you about the difference between being owned and being loved." She spoke about her childhood with her mother, the safety and creativity that had been stripped away when illness claimed the only person who had ever truly cared for her. She described the years with Harold Brennan, the systematic destruction of her spirit through violence and degradation. "He told me every day that I was worthless, that I existed only to serve others, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of humanity I was allowed." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued, "But he was wrong. I am not property. I never was property, and I will never be property again." She turned slightly to look at Marcus, her expression soft with genuine affection. "Marcus didn't buy me that day at the auction. He rescued me. He saw a human being in distress and chose to help without asking for anything in return. He gave me back my name, my dignity, and my future." Sarah faced the judge again, her stance radiating confidence and determination. I am 17 years old, Your Honor. In 3 months, I will be 18 and legally free to make my own choices, but I shouldn't have to wait for a birthday to claim my basic human rights. I choose to stay with Marcus Reed because he is my family in every way that matters. I choose the Healing Ranch because it is my home and my calling. And I choose to fight anyone who tries to reduce me to a dollar amount on a ledger sheet. The courtroom erupted in applause that Judge Martinez had to gavel down repeatedly. Hawthorne objected to the emotional manipulation, but his complaints sounded hollow in the face of Sarah's raw honesty. The opposition's case crumbled quickly under cross-examination. Walsh systematically exposed the consortium's true nature, a network of human traffickers and loan sharks who preyed on vulnerable families. She presented evidence of their other business arrangements, documented cases of young people who had disappeared after being claimed as collateral. When Hawthorne called Harold Brennan's former associates to testify about the legitimate nature of their agreements, Walsh was ready with arrest records, outstanding warrants, and testimony from other victims who had escaped their network. Your Honor, Walsh concluded in her closing argument, the opposing counsel wants you to believe this is about contract law and property rights. But this case is really about whether we will allow a criminal enterprise to use our courts to legitimize human trafficking. Sarah Davis was never collateral for anyone's debts. She was a child who was abused, exploited, and would have been sold into slavery if not for the intervention of a good man who saw her humanity when others saw only profit. Judge Martinez recessed for 2 hours to consider her decision. Marcus and Sarah waited in a small conference room, surrounded by their supporters, but lost in their own thoughts. Whatever happened next would determine not just their future together, but whether their sanctuary could continue helping other damaged souls find healing. When court reconvened, Judge Martinez's expression revealed nothing. She surveyed the packed courtroom for a long moment before beginning to speak. In 30 years on the bench, I have rarely encountered a case that so clearly illustrates the conflict between legal technicalities and moral imperatives, she began. The plaintiffs argue that they have valid contracts entitling them to collect on Harold Brennan's debts using Sarah Davis as collateral. The defendants argue that such contracts are fundamentally illegitimate because human beings cannot be property. Marcus held his breath as the judge continued. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, this court finds that the alleged contracts are void ab initio, invalid from the beginning, because they violate both state and federal laws prohibiting human trafficking. No court in this country will enforce agreements that treat human beings as chattel to be bought and sold. The courtroom exploded in cheers, but Judge Martinez wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court finds that Sarah Davis has been thriving under the guardianship of Marcus Reed, and that their unconventional but clearly successful arrangement serves the minor's best interests. The guardianship will remain in effect until Miss Davis reaches the age of majority, at which point she will be free to make her own choices about her future. Sarah collapsed into Marcus's arms, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. Around them, the courtroom continued to celebrate, but Marcus was focused entirely on the young woman who had become his daughter in every way that mattered. "We won," Sarah whispered against his shoulder. "We actually won." "You won," Marcus corrected, gently. "You stood up for yourself, spoke your truth, and refused to let anyone define your worth. I'm proud of you." The aftermath of the trial brought changes none of them had anticipated. The media attention surrounding their case led to an avalanche of support for the Healing Ranch. Donations poured in from across the country, allowing them to expand their facilities and take in even more animals in need of rehabilitation. Sarah's story inspired legislation aimed at closing loopholes that allowed traffickers to use debt agreements to claim ownership of vulnerable people. She was invited to speak at conferences, testify before congressional committees, and share her expertise on trauma recovery with professionals around the world. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the steady stream of visitors who came to the ranch seeking the same kind of healing Sarah and the horses had found. Veterans struggling with PTSD, abuse survivors learning to trust again, former addicts building new lives. They came seeking not a quick fix, but a place where they could take the time needed to truly heal. Winter returned to the Montana mountains, but this time it felt different. The expanded facilities were warm and welcoming, filled with the sounds of humans and animals learning to trust and hope again. The barn that had once housed only Amber now sheltered 12 horses in various stages of recovery, each with their own story of trauma and triumph. Marcus had hired additional staff to help with the growing operation, but Sarah remained the heart of the rehabilitation program. Her intuitive understanding of trauma, combined with formal training she was pursuing through correspondence courses, made her uniquely qualified to help both animals and humans navigate the difficult path from brokenness to wholeness. On Christmas Eve, exactly 18 months after that first day at the auction, Marcus found Sarah in the barn, making her evening rounds. She moved among the horses with the confidence of someone who knew her purpose and place in the world, speaking to each animal in the gentle tones that had become her trademark. "Remember when this was just you and me and Amber?" Marcus asked, leaning against the doorframe. Sarah smiled, stroking the neck of a new arrival, a young Mustang who had been rescued from an illegal breeding operation. "Seems like a lifetime ago. Sometimes I can barely remember being that scared girl who wouldn't speak above a whisper." "She's still part of you," Marcus observed. "That experience, that pain, it's what gives you the ability to connect with others who are hurting." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I used to think my past was something to be ashamed of, something that made me damaged goods. Now I understand it was preparation for this, for helping others find their way home to themselves." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the horses settle in for the night. Through the barn windows, they could see the lights of the main house, where several current residents were gathered around the fireplace, sharing stories and building the kind of chosen family that had saved them all. "I have something for you," Marcus said, pulling a wrapped package from his jacket pocket. Sarah opened it carefully, revealing a small wooden plaque with brass lettering that read, "Sarah Reed, Director of Equine Rehabilitation." Below that, in smaller text, "Where healing begins with hope." "Read?" Sarah asked, her voice catching slightly. "If you want it," Marcus replied. "I know it's not traditional, but neither are we. You're my daughter, Sarah. You have been since the day I chose to bring you home." Sarah's tears were the happy kind this time, the kind that came from joy too large to contain. "I've never had a real last name before. Sarah Reed. I like how that sounds." As they made their final checks on the animals and prepared to head back to the house, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He'd gone to that auction looking for nothing more than a way to fill his empty days. Instead, he'd found a daughter, a purpose, and a family that extended far beyond blood relations. The girl who had once been traded for a lame mule was now a confident young woman preparing to change the world, one damaged soul at a time. The broken soldier who had lost his identity when he lost his career had found a new mission that gave meaning to every day, and the wounded horse who had been deemed worthless was now the matriarch of a herd that taught everyone around them about resilience and grace. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked as they walked through the snow toward the warmly lit house. "About how sometimes the worst things that happen to us prepare us for the best things we'll ever do," Marcus replied. "About how broken doesn't mean worthless, and healing doesn't mean forgetting. Sarah slipped her arm through his, and they walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence. Behind them, the barn glowed with warmth and life, sheltering creatures who had learned that safety was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, and that love was stronger than any trauma. Inside the house, their extended family waited, fellow survivors who had found their way to the healing ranch and chosen to stay, either temporarily or permanently. There was Elena, a former victim of domestic violence who now helped with administrative duties. David, a veteran dealing with traumatic brain injury who had a gift for connecting with the most difficult horses. Maria, a teenager who had aged out of foster care and found her calling in equine therapy. They gathered around the dinner table that night, sharing food and stories and the kind of laughter that came from people who understood both darkness and light. It wasn't a traditional family by any measure, but it was theirs, bound together by choice, strengthened by shared experience, and united in their commitment to helping others find their way home. Later, as Marcus made his final check on the property, he paused at Amber's stall. The mare who had started it all looked up from her hay, her eyes bright with contentment. Her injured leg would always mark her as different, but it no longer defined her. She was a mother figure to the newer horses, a teacher and guide who showed them that survival was possible. "Thank you," Marcus whispered to the horse, who had helped him understand that being broken didn't mean being beyond repair. Amber nickered softly in response, then returned to her hay. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that would melt with spring's return. It was the cycle of seasons, of loss and renewal, of endings that became beginnings. Marcus Reed had learned to trust in tomorrow again. Sarah Reed had found her voice and her purpose. And somewhere in the peaceful quiet of the Montana mountains, broken things continued to heal, one gentle day at a time. The story that had begun with an auction and a desperate rescue had become something larger, a testament to the power of love to transform even the most damaged hearts. It was proof that families could be chosen, that worth was not determined by usefulness, and that sometimes the most beautiful things grew from the deepest wounds. Dawn would come again, as it always did. And when it did, it would illuminate a place where healing happened, hope flourished, and every broken thing was given the chance to become whole again. The healing ranch stood as a beacon in the darkness, calling to all who needed to remember that they were not alone, not forgotten, and never ever worthless. In a world that often threw away what it deemed broken, this place stood as proof that with patience, love, and time, anything could be made beautiful again. The sunrise painted the mountains gold, and another day of healing began. 5 years later, the healing ranch had become something Marcus could never have imagined during those dark months after his discharge from the military. What had started as a desperate attempt to save one broken horse and one damaged girl had evolved into a nationally recognized center for trauma recovery that drew visitors from around the world. Sarah, now 22 and officially Sarah Reed, stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Montana, delivering the keynote address at the annual conference on animal-assisted therapy. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and she wore a navy blazer over a dress. She'd painted with tiny horses along the hem, a signature touch that reminded everyone of her artistic roots. "Healing is not a destination," she told the audience of therapists, veterinarians, and social workers. "It's a journey that requires courage, patience, and most importantly, the belief that every living being has inherent worth, regardless of what trauma they've endured." In the audience, Marcus watched with pride as his daughter commanded the room with the same quiet authority she'd once used to calm frightened horses. The scared girl, who had flinched at her own name, was now Dr. Sarah Reed, having completed her doctorate in veterinary medicine with a specialization in trauma recovery at an unprecedented pace. After her speech, they drove back to the ranch together, the familiar mountain roads unwinding before them like a ribbon of memory. The property had expanded to encompass nearly 200 acres, with multiple barn complexes, therapy centers, and residential facilities for both humans and animals, in various stages of recovery. "Remember when our biggest worry was whether we could afford Amber's medicine?" Sarah mused as they passed the original barn, now designated as the Founders Building in honor of their humble beginnings. Marcus chuckled, his hand unconsciously moving to his leg, which still ached on cold days, but no longer defined his limitations. "Now we're worried about managing a staff of 40 and a waiting list that stretches 6 months. They pulled into the main parking area, where several news vans were setting up equipment. A documentary crew from National Geographic had been following their work for the past year, creating a film about innovative approaches to trauma therapy that would air next month. "Dr. Reed," called out Rebecca Martinez, the documentary's director. "Perfect timing. We're just setting up for the sunset interview by the Memorial Garden." The Memorial Garden had been Sarah's idea 3 years ago. It honored the animals and people who hadn't made it to healing, those who had been lost to trauma, neglect, or the simple failure of society to recognize their worth. Amber's memorial stone sat at the center, surrounded by flowers that bloomed in rotation throughout the seasons. The old mare had lived to the remarkable age of 28, passing peacefully in her sleep 2 winters ago, but her legacy lived on in every horse that found sanctuary at the ranch, in every person who learned that broken didn't mean worthless. As the film crew prepared their equipment, Marcus walked through the memorial garden, reading the names etched in stone. Some belonged to horses like Thunder, who had overcome his fear of humans to become a therapy animal for veterans with PTSD before succumbing to age-related illness. Others honored people like Eleanor, the domestic violence survivor, who had become their first full-time counselor before losing her battle with cancer, but not before training a dozen others to carry on her work. "The hardest part of this work," Sarah said, appearing beside him, "is that not every story has a happy ending. But that makes the successes even more precious." The documentary interview took place as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Sarah spoke eloquently about the ranch's evolution from a desperate rescue operation to a model for trauma-informed care that was being replicated across the country. "We've learned that healing happens in relationship," she explained to the camera. "Not just the relationship between therapist and client, but the relationships between survivors, between humans and animals, between individuals and the community that supports them." Marcus found himself remembering that first winter, when their biggest achievement was getting Sarah to eat a full meal or convincing Amber to accept her medication. Now the ranch housed 37 horses, including several that had been born on the property to mares who had recovered enough to become mothers. The human residents numbered 15 at any given time, ranging from teenagers aging out of foster care to military veterans seeking alternatives to traditional therapy. The success stories were remarkable. Jake Morrison's grandson, who had struggled with autism spectrum disorder, had found his voice working with a gentle draft horse named Patience. A former gang member from Los Angeles had discovered his calling training rescued Mustangs for adoption. 3 separate couples had met at the ranch, bonded over their shared commitment to healing, and gone on to establish their own therapeutic programs in other states. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was Marcus's own. The bitter, isolated veteran who had stumbled into the auction that day had become a recognized expert in trauma recovery, co-authoring papers with Sarah, and speaking at conferences about the intersection of military experience and therapeutic practice. "You know what I realized today?" Sarah said as they walked back toward the main house after the film crew departed. "We've become the family that finds lost things and helps them remember they were never really lost at all." The main house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing operation, but they'd kept the original kitchen and living room exactly as they'd been during those first difficult months. Tonight, as every night, the staff and residents gathered for dinner, a tradition that had started with just Marcus, Sarah, and whatever leftovers they could cobble together. The dining room buzzed with conversation in English and Spanish, punctuated by laughter and the occasional heated debate about horse training techniques or therapy protocols. At the head of the table sat David Chen, Dr. Chen's nephew, who had come to the ranch as a troubled teenager and stayed to become their lead equine specialist. Beside him, Maria Santos, now a licensed therapist herself, helped a new resident navigate the complex emotions of her first week in recovery. "Family meeting tomorrow night," Sarah announced over dessert. "We need to discuss the proposal from the State University about establishing a formal internship program." Marcus smiled at the casual way Sarah wielded her authority. She'd never demanded respect or recognition. It had simply grown around her like wildflowers, natural and unforced. The ranch operated as a collaborative effort, but everyone understood that Sarah's vision and Marcus's leadership formed the foundation that made everything else possible. Later that evening, Marcus made his traditional rounds, checking on the animals and saying goodnight to the residents who were still awake. In the new barn, he found Tommy Rodriguez, a 17-year-old who'd arrived just 2 weeks earlier, sitting beside the stall of a young Mustang who'd been rescued from a hoarding situation. "Can't sleep?" Marcus asked gently. Tommy shook his big head. "She keeps having nightmares, thrashing around, making scared noises. I thought maybe if someone stayed with her—" Marcus recognized the deflection. Tommy wasn't staying up for the horse's sake. He was staying up because his own nightmares made sleep a battleground he wasn't ready to fight. "Mind if I sit with you?" Marcus asked, settling onto a hay bale without waiting for an answer. They sat in comfortable silence, two survivors keeping vigil over a third. The Mustang, a bay mare they'd named Spirit, gradually calmed under their presence, her breathing evening out as she settled into deeper rest. "Does it ever stop?" Tommy asked eventually. "The fear, the memories, the feeling like you're always waiting for something bad to happen?" Marcus considered his answer carefully. "It changes. The nightmares become less frequent, the triggers lose some of their power, and you learn techniques for managing the difficult moments. But more importantly, you build a life that's bigger than your trauma. You find purposes and people and passions that matter more than your pain." "How long did it take for you?" "I'm still figuring it out," Marcus admitted. "But I'm not figuring it out alone anymore. That makes all the difference." Tommy nodded, and Marcus could see the boy processing this information, weighing it against his own experience and fears. "Dr. Reed says I might be able to work with the horses eventually. If I want to. Sarah has good instincts about these things. What do you think?" "I think—" Tommy paused, gathering courage. "I think maybe I'd like to learn how to help them feel safe, the way you and Dr. Reed helped me feel safe." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever he witnessed someone taking their first tentative steps toward hope. "I think that's exactly what Sarah was hoping you'd say." The night rounds continued through all 6 barn complexes, past the therapy arenas, where daytime sessions helped both humans and animals practice trust and communication, through the gardens where residents grew vegetables and flowers as part of their healing process. Each building held stories of transformation, of lives reclaimed from the wreckage of trauma and abuse. In the original barn, now housing the program's elder horses, Marcus stopped at Moonbeam's stall. The paint mare who'd arrived starving and hollow-eyed was now a beloved therapy horse, her gentle nature making her perfect for working with children who'd experienced neglect or abandonment. "Hey, old girl," Marcus murmured, offering her a carrot from his pocket. "Remember when you were afraid to eat because you thought the food might disappear?" Moonbeam crunched contentedly, her eyes bright with health and contentment. She'd become something of a ranch mascot, appearing in promotional materials and serving as living proof that even the most damaged beings could rediscover joy. As Marcus completed his rounds, he reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them all together. A soldier's broken body, a girl's shattered spirit, a horse's ruined leg. Separately, they'd been discarded by a world that valued only strength and utility. Together, they'd created something beautiful and lasting. A place where weakness was transformed into wisdom and scars became sources of strength. The ranch operated on a simple philosophy that had emerged from their own experience. Healing happened, not through fixing what was broken, but through learning to love what was different. Every horse that arrived with physical or emotional damage was valued, not despite their limitations, but because of the unique perspective those limitations provided. Every human resident brought gifts that could only be offered by someone who had survived the unsurvivable. Sarah found Marcus on the front porch of the main house, sitting in the rocking chair they'd added after his 50th birthday. She settled into the chair beside him, both of them looking out over the property they'd built together. "The National Geographic people want to do a follow-up piece in 2 years," she said. "Track the progress of some of our current residents, see how the program evolves." "What did you tell them?" "That we'd be honored, but they'll have to understand that this place belongs to the people and animals who call it home. We're not a zoo or a spectacle, we're a family." Marcus nodded approvingly. Sarah had learned to navigate the media attention. Their success had brought while never losing sight of their core mission. Fame and recognition were tools to be used in service of helping others, not ends in themselves. "I got a call from the governor's office today," Marcus said. "They want to nominate you for the state's humanitarian award." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "I hope they understand that if they give it to me, they're really giving it to everyone who's ever found healing here, including you. Especially me. You saved my life, Sarah. Not that day at the auction. You saved my life every day since then by giving me a reason to get up in the morning, a purpose worth pursuing." "We saved each other," Sarah corrected gently. "That's what family does." As the night deepened and the mountain air grew crisp, they sat together in the comfortable silence that had become their trademark. Around them, the ranch settled into a peaceful quiet, the sounds of healing dreams replacing the nightmares that had once haunted so many of their residents. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Damaged animals in need of care, traumatized humans seeking sanctuary, bureaucratic obstacles to overcome, and the endless work of building something good in a world that often seemed determined to tear down hope. But they would face those challenges together, as they always had, with patience and love and the unshakable belief that every living being deserved a second chance. The Healing Ranch stood as a testament to the power of choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and connection over isolation. It proved that broken things could be beautiful, that scars could be sources of strength, and that sometimes the most profound healing happened not in hospitals or clinics, but in the simple act of one damaged soul reaching out to help another. In the distance, a horse whinnied softly, calling to its herdmates in the darkness. It was answered by a chorus of gentle voices, a conversation of creatures who had learned that they were no longer alone. The sound carried across the mountain air like a lullaby, a promise that morning would come again, and with it another day of hope, healing, and the endless possibility of love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.